In the vast, sterile archives of American corporate history, there are numbers that haunt us. We know the number of people who died on the Titanic. We know the number of soldiers who fell at Gettysburg. We know the death toll of the San Francisco earthquake. But there is one number that has been quietly buried, a number that represents a catastrophe so large it is almost impossible to comprehend. Yet it took place not on a battlefield or a sinking ship, but in the living rooms and pharmacies of suburban America. That number is 60,000. 60,000 men and women, fathers, grandmothers, teachers, construction workers. That is the estimated number of Americans who died because they swallowed a pill called Vioxx. To put that into a horrifying perspective, that is more American lives lost than in the entire Vietnam War. It is more than 10 times the death toll of September 11th. And unlike those tragedies, this was not an act of war. It was not a natural disaster. It was a business decision. This is not a story about a medical mistake. Mistakes happen. Science is hard. This is a story about a calculation. It is a story about a pharmaceutical giant that saw the warning signs, saw the clinical data, and realized that the drug in their hands was a ticking time bomb for the human heart. And then they looked at the potential revenue, they looked at the stock price, and they decided to pull the pin and throw it into the crowd anyway. This is the verified, documented story of the greatest drug safety catastrophe in modern history. This is how Merck killed 60,000 people for profit. To understand the magnitude of this crime, you have to transport yourself back to the late 1990s. It was a different world. The economy was booming. The internet was young, and the pharmaceutical industry was undergoing a radical transformation. For decades, drug companies had been relatively quiet entities. They made medicine, doctors prescribed it, and that was the loop. But in the 90s, everything changed. The regulations on direct-to-consumer advertising were loosened. Suddenly, television wasn't just for selling beer and cars. It was for selling depression medication, allergy pills, and lifestyle drugs. Merck was the king of this hill for 7 years in a row. Fortune magazine had named Merck America's most admired company. They were the blue chip of blue chips. Their reputation was sterling. Their motto, handed down from the founder's son, George W. Merck, was carved into the corporate ethos. Medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. But by 1998, the executives in White House Station, New Jersey, were not thinking about George W. Merck's motto. They were thinking about the patent cliff. In the pharmaceutical game, a patent is your lifeline. You have 20 years from the moment you file the paperwork to make your money, but since 10 of those years are spent in testing, you really only have a decade of monopoly profits. Once that patent expires, the generic wolves come to the door. They copy your formula. The price drops by 90% and your revenue stream evaporates. Merck was staring into the abyss. Their biggest patents for drugs like Vasotec and Pepcid were about to expire. Their stock price was vulnerable. Wall Street was getting anxious. They didn't just need a new product. They needed a blockbuster. They needed a wonder drug. They needed something that could be prescribed to millions of people every single day for the rest of their lives. And they found their target in the most universal human experience. For a century, humanity had relied on NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen, they were effective. But they had a flaw. They worked by blocking an enzyme called cyclooxygenase, or COX. But there are two types of COX. COX-2 causes pain and inflammation, but COX-1 protects the lining of your stomach. The old drugs were blunt instruments. They blocked both. So while they stopped your headache, they also stripped away the protection in your gut. If you took high doses for arthritis, you risked ulcers, bleeds, and hospitalization. This was the NSAID problem. The solution, the holy grail, was a COX-2 inhibitor, a smart bomb, a drug that would snipe the pain enzyme COX-2, but leave the stomach enzyme COX-1 alone. All the relief, none of the ulcers. It was a license to print money. Merck developed their contender. They named it Vioxx. The science seemed elegant. But biology is not a computer code. It is a complex, chaotic ecosystem of checks and balances. When you manipulate one enzyme, you ripple through the entire system. And the scientists at Merck, The brilliant minds in the labs saw a potential problem very early on. It turns out that COX-2 does more than just cause pain. It regulates a substance in the blood called prostacyclin. Prostacyclin is a hero molecule. It dilates your blood vessels, and crucially, it prevents your blood platelets from clumping together. It is your body's natural defense against clots. So the hypothesis was terrifyingly simple. If you block COX-2, you suppress prostacyclin, you take away the body's natural blood thinner, but you leave the clotting factors untouched. You create a biological environment that is pro-thrombotic. You are practically inviting the blood to clot, and when blood clots in the heart, you die. Merck knew this. We know they knew this because of the emails. In litigation years later, millions of pages of internal documents were dragged into the sunlight. As early as 1996, 3 years before the launch, Merck scientists were discussing this risk. In one meeting, they noted that the lack of anti-clotting effects could lead to an increase in cardiovascular events. They had a choice right then. They could have said, this mechanism is too risky. We need to go back to the drawing board. Or we need to run massive long-term heart safety trials before we give this to the public. They did neither. The clock was ticking. The patent cliff was approaching. The marketing machine was already hungry. They pushed the launch button. In May 1999, the FDA approved Vioxx, and Merck unleashed the greatest marketing blitz the world had ever seen. They spent $160 million in the launch year alone promoting Vioxx. That is a staggering number. They spent more money selling Vioxx than Pepsi spent selling soda. They spent more than Budweiser spent selling beer. They blanketed the airwaves. They hired Dorothy Hamill, the Olympic figure skating champion. The commercials were masterpieces of emotional manipulation. They featured the song, It's a Beautiful Morning. You saw people with arthritis running, skating, playing with their grandchildren, liberated from pain. It worked. It worked beyond their wildest dreams. In the first year, doctors wrote millions of prescriptions. Vioxx became a status symbol. It was the new thing. Patients would walk into their doctor's office and demand the drug they saw on TV, and doctors, overwhelmed and trusting of the pharmaceutical giant, obliged. But while the champagne was popping in the boardroom, the data was starting to darken. Merck needed to secure their dominance. They wanted to prove definitively that Vioxx was safer on the stomach than the older drugs. This would allow them to put a superior safety claim on the label, which would justify the high price tag. Vioxx cost about $4 a pill. Generic ibuprofen cost pennies. So in January 2000, Merck launched the VIGOR Study. VIGOR stood for Vioxx Gastrointestinal Outcomes Research. It was a massive trial, 8,000 patients. Half were given Vioxx. Half were given Naproxen generic alive. The trial was designed to look at the stomach, and on that front, it succeeded. Vioxx caused fewer ulcers. The marketing team was ready to celebrate, but then the safety report arrived when the scientists looked at the cardiovascular data. The heart attacks, the strokes, the blood clots, the numbers were catastrophic. The patients taking Vioxx had suffered heart attacks at a rate 5 times higher than the patients taking Naproxen, a 500% increase in risk. In the world of clinical trials, a signal is a subtle hint that something might be wrong. This was not a signal. This was an air raid siren. This was a 5-alarm fire. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment where George W. Merck's motto, medicine is for the people, should have kicked in. A responsible company would have halted the trial, alerted the FDA immediately, and perhaps even pulled the drug until they could understand why people were dying. Merck did not do that. Instead, they gathered their executives and their scientists, and they constructed a lie so audacious, so complex, and so deadly that it would become the centerpiece of the scandal. They called it the Naproxen hypothesis. Here is how the spin worked. They couldn't deny the data. The chart clearly showed more heart attacks on the Vioxx side, but they argued that the problem wasn't Vioxx. They argued that Vioxx was neutral, safe as water. The difference, they claimed, was that Naproxen was actually a powerful blood thinner. They told the FDA and the world that Naproxen was protecting the heart, acting like a super-aspirin. And that's why the Naproxen group had fewer heart attacks. Vioxx only looked bad by comparison. It was a brilliant argument. It was scientific jujitsu. It used the data against itself. There was just one problem. It was completely made up. There was no clinical evidence that naproxen had a protective effect of that magnitude, none. Naproxen is a painkiller, not a heart drug. Deep inside Merck, the top scientists knew this hypothesis was garbage. In a now infamous email from March 2000, Merck's research president, Dr. Edward Skolnick, looked at the VIGOR data. He didn't praise the naproxen theory. He wrote to his colleagues, "It is a shame, but it is a low incidence, and it is mechanism based as we worried it was." Read that again, mechanism based as we worried it was. He was admitting in writing that the drug's mechanism, the suppression of prostacyclin, was causing the heart attacks. He validated the fear they had in 1996, but publicly. The lie continued. Merck issued a press release headlined, "Merck confirms favorable cardiovascular safety profile of Vioxx." They took a study that showed a 5-fold increase in heart attacks and called it favorable. It was gaslighting on an industrial scale. They submitted the VIGOR data to the FDA, but they didn't just submit it. They manipulated how it was viewed. They used cut-off dates to exclude heart attacks that happened later in the study. They categorized some heart events as unknown to dilute the numbers. And then they armed their army. Merck had a sales force of 3,000 representatives. These were the foot soldiers. They were young, attractive, driven, and highly incentivized. Merck produced a training video and manual for them. During the later trials, this manual was entered into evidence. Its title, Dodgeball. The manual was a literal instruction guide on how to dodge doctors' questions about heart attacks. If a doctor asked, "I saw the VIGOR data. I'm worried about the heart risk," the rep was trained to pivot. "Doctor, let's focus on the gastrointestinal benefits." "Doctor, you have to understand the naproxen difference." One internal memo was explicit: "Do not initiate discussions on the cardiovascular results." It was a conspiracy of silence. But you cannot keep a disaster this size quiet forever. There were doctors who saw through the smoke. One of them was Dr. Eric Topol, a giant in the field of cardiology at the Cleveland Clinic. He looked at the VIGOR data and realized the naproxen hypothesis was mathematical nonsense. He published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, warning about the risk. Merck went to war. They didn't answer Jakar. Topol with better science, they answered him with intimidation. Internal emails revealed a hit list of dissenting doctors. They monitored these doctors. They tracked their speeches, and they discussed how to silence them. In one terrifying email chain, a Merck executive discussed a doctor who was refusing to prescribe Vioxx and was vocal about his concerns. The executive wrote, "We may need to seek them out and destroy them where they live. Destroy them where they live." They contacted the deans of universities to complain about professors. They threatened to pull funding. They ghost-wrote articles, paying prominent doctors to put their names on papers that were actually written by Merck marketing teams. To flood the medical journals with positive news, they created an artificial consensus. And while this war was being fought in the medical journals, people were dying in the real world. Men in their 40s were dropping dead on treadmills. Grandmothers were dying in their sleep. The cause of death was always listed as heart attack or stroke. Natural causes, because heart attacks are common, nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized that natural cause was actually a chemical trigger. The drug was the perfect murderer. It mimicked nature perfectly. But there was a watchdog. Theoretically, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, is the shield that is supposed to protect American citizens from corporate greed. But in the early 2000s, the shield was rusted. Years prior, Congress had passed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA. This law allowed drug companies to pay user fees to the FDA to speed up the approval process. It created a perverse dynamic. The pharmaceutical industry was now the FDA's client. The regulators were dependent on the funding of the regulated. The FDA officials handling Vioxx were slow to act. They debated the label language for months, dragging their feet. While millions of prescriptions were being filled, they eventually added a warning, but it was weak. It was buried in the fine print. However, there was one man inside the FDA who refused to be complicit. His name was Dr. David Graham. He was the Associate Director for Science and Medicine at the FDA's Office of Drug Safety. He was a scientist, meticulous, quiet, data-driven. In 2004, Graham decided to bypass the clinical trial data and look at the real world. He conducted a study using the records of 14 million patients from Kaiser Permanente. This was big data before the term existed. When he ran the numbers, his blood ran cold. The data showed that high-dose Vioxx increased the risk of heart attack and sudden cardiac death by 37 times. When he extrapolated that risk across the U.S. population, the math was horrifying. He estimated that Vioxx had already caused between 8,000 and 14,000 excess cases of serious heart disease. And based on mortality rates, that meant roughly 6,000 deaths. Graham realized he was looking at a plague. He tried to publish his findings. He tried to sound the alarm. But instead of being hailed as a hero, he was treated as an insurgent. His superiors at the FDA pushed back. They called his science junk. They pressured him to water down his conclusions. They tried to block publication of his study. Why? Because admitting Vioxx was a killer meant admitting the FDA had failed. It meant the agency had approved a drug that killed more people than a war. But Graham held the line. He later testified before the U.S. Senate in a hearing that shocked the nation. He sat before the senators and said, "I was pressured to change my conclusions and recommendations." He told them that he feared for his job, and he delivered the line that should be engraved on the tombstone of this scandal. The FDA, as currently configured, is incapable of protecting America against another Vioxx. We are virtually defenseless. The dam finally broke in September 2004. Merck had been conducting yet another study, the APPROV trial, testing Vioxx for the prevention of colon polyps. This time, there was no naproxen control group. It was Vioxx versus a placebo, a sugar pill. After 18 months, the Safety Monitoring Board halted the study. The Vioxx group was having significantly more heart attacks and strokes than the placebo group. The naproxen hypothesis was dead. There was no hiding it. On September 30, 2004, Merck CEO Ray Gilmartin announced the global withdrawal of Vioxx. The drug was pulled from shelves in 80 countries. Patients were told to flush their pills down the toilet. Merck's stock crashed, losing $27 billion in market value in a single day. But for the families of the victims, the withdrawal was too late. The legal reckoning began. Thousands of lawsuits were filed. The first case to reach a verdict was in Texas. The plaintiff was a woman named Carol Ernst. Her husband, Robert, had been a produce manager at Walmart. He was a marathon runner. He was 59. He took Vioxx for hand pain and died in his sleep of an arrhythmia. Merck sent a legion of high-priced defense lawyers to Texas. Their strategy was to blame the victim. They argued Robert Ernst had clogged arteries. He didn't. They argued he died of natural causes. They tried to bury the widow in paperwork and scientific jargon. But the plaintiff's attorney, Mark Lanier, did something brilliant. He didn't just argue the medicine. He put the company's soul on trial. He displayed the internal emails on a giant screen. He showed the jury the dodgeball manual. He showed them the destroy them, where they live email. He painted a picture of a corporation that viewed its customers not as patients, but as revenue units. The jury was out for only a short time. They returned with a verdict. Merck was liable. They awarded Carol Ernst $253 million. It was a thunderclap. It signaled to Wall Street that the cover-up was going to cost them. Merck fought back, appealing the verdict and winning on technicalities. But the damage was done. The floodgates were open. Documents continued to leak. The public trust was shattered. In November 2007, Merck agreed to a mass settlement. They would pay $4.85 billion to resolve tens of thousands of lawsuits. Later, they would plead guilty to a criminal misdemeanor for misbranding and pay nearly another $1 billion to the federal government. $6 billion. It sounds like justice. It sounds like a punishment that fits the crime. But let's look at the ledger. During the 5 years Vioxx was on the market, it was a cash cow. It generated roughly $2.5 billion a year in revenue. Merck made approximately $11 billion in total sales from the drug. Do the math, $11 billion in revenue, $6 billion in fines and settlements. They still made money even after killing 60,000 people, even after the lawyers took their cut. even after the largest settlement in history. The drug was profitable, the fines were tax deductible, the stock price eventually recovered. Today, Merck is worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and the people responsible, Ray Gilmartin, the CEO, resigned under pressure. He kept his stock options. He walked away with a package worth millions. Darker, Peter Kim, the research executive, stayed on. Not a single executive faced criminal charges for manslaughter. Not one person spent a night in a jail cell. The Vioxx scandal is often taught in business ethics classes as a failure of leadership, but that is too soft a description. It wasn't a failure. It was a success of a certain kind of logic, the logic of the bottom line. It revealed a terrifying truth about the medical system we rely on. We assume that if a doctor prescribes a pill, it is safe. We assume the FDA has rigorously tested it. We assume that science is an objective pursuit of truth. Vioxx proved that science can be bought. It proved that regulators can be captured. And it proved that for a publicly traded corporation, human life is just a variable in an equation. If the cost of the lawsuits is lower than the profit from the sales, the drug stays on the market. It has been 20 years since Vioxx was pulled. The executives have moved on to other boards, other yachts, other lives. The headlines have faded. But in cemeteries across America, there are 60,000 headstones that shouldn't be there. There are graduations that fathers missed. There are weddings where mothers were absent. There is a generation of loss that can never be settled with a check. The next time you watch the news and see a pharmaceutical company settle a lawsuit for $1 billion, do not be impressed by the size of the number. Ask what they made, ask what they knew, and remember that in the world of big business, $1 billion fine isn't a punishment. It's just the cost of doing business.